Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something really fundamental to how the United States runs, political parties.
Yeah, and we've got this great chapter here simply called Political Parties that we're going to walk through.
Our goal in this deep dive for you is to get a really clear picture of America's party system.
Right. We'll look at, where it all started, what these parties actually do, and some of the big challenges they're grappling with right now.
And it's kind of a paradox, isn't it? You hear so many complaints about political parties, they're too divisive, maybe they don't really stand for anything solid. Yet the material we're looking at makes a pretty strong argument that modern democracy, well, it basically needs them.
It does. It seems fundamental.
So let's dive in. What exactly is a political party in the U.S. context?
Well, in essence, political parties are groups of individuals who, share similar goals for the country.
Okay, similar.
And they band together to get their people elected because winning elections, that's the key to putting their policy ideas into action.
Got it. So it's not just about having opinions, it's about the active pursuit of power to implement those opinions. How does that actually play out? What do they do?
They wear a lot of hats, actually. Once they're in power, they're typically the ones drafting proposed laws, often pulling directly from their party platforms.
Right, those platforms we hear about.
Exactly. Then they guide these bills through Congress, encouraging their members to vote along party lines. They also nominate candidates for all sorts of offices.
Local, state, national.
Yep. Coordinate the campaigns, which are incredibly complex these days. And crucially, they work really hard to mobilize their voters, get them out to the polls.
Right, they're sort of the engine behind the whole electoral machine. Now, the chapter also makes a point of distinguishing parties from interest groups. What's the main difference there?
That's a really important distinction. Interest groups, they usually try to influence policy indirectly.
Like lobbying.
Yeah, lobbying, running public awareness campaigns, that sort of thing. Political parties, though, they're aiming for direct control. They want to win elections so their members hold the offices and make the decisions directly.
Okay, so indirect influence versus actually being in the driver's seat. You mentioned party platforms again. What are those exactly? How are they formed?
So a party platform is basically a big statement. It lays out the party's core beliefs and its positions on a whole range of important issues.
Like a manifesto.
Sort of, yeah. They're formally adopted every 4 years, usually at the big presidential nominating conventions. It's the party saying, here's our agenda, here's what we plan to do if we win.
The reading even gives us this fascinating historical example. The Progressive Party platform from 1912. What kinds of things were in that?
It's really quite striking. They were advocating for things like making campaign finance transparent, an 8-hour workday, a federal income tax.
Wow, way back then.
And even women's suffrage. It really shows how these third parties, even if they don't win big, can push major ideas into the mainstream conversation.
Absolutely. You can see those ideas taking root. But trying to build a platform that appeals to enough people to win, that must be a real balancing act.
Oh, completely. Parties are constantly wrestling with this. How do you build a coalition broad enough to win elections, but, not so diverse internally that you can't actually govern?
Right, because then you get gridlock.
Exactly. A really narrow, ideologically pure party might struggle to get enough votes. But a super broad, big tent party might win and then find its members can't agree on anything fundamental. It's a constant tension.
Okay, so that's what parties are and what they try to do. But how did they actually emerge in the U.S.? Let's go back to the early days of the Republic.
Right. So early on, politics was very different. Much more local, dominated by elites. Voting rights were restricted.
And the national issues were more about just setting up the government.
Right.
Basic structure, security.
Exactly. But even then, different ideas started bubbling up about the best path forward.
And that leads to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
Yeah.
What was the core disagreement?
Precisely. The Federalists, they strongly backed the new Constitution and wanted a more powerful central government, especially for things like the economy. Think Alexander Hamilton.
Okay.
The Anti-Federalists were much more cautious about central power. They really championed the autonomy of the individual states.
It's interesting. Wasn't even George Washington sort of aligned with the Federalists initially? Didn't he warn against parties?
He did, famously in his farewell address. He worried they'd become too divisive, put partisan interests ahead of the national good.
Whoa.
But the practical reality of organizing supporters and electing leaders who shared a vision, well, it quickly led those early factions to become more formal parties. You had the Federalists, led by John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson.
Which brings us to the Revolution of 1800. That sounds dramatic. Why was that election so important?
It was a huge deal because it exposed a major flaw in how the Electoral College originally worked. Well, back then, the person with the most electoral votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. In 1800, this resulted in a tie between Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr.
Oh, wow. That couldn't have been the intention.
Definitely not. The source material even has a figure showing just how close it was. The decision got thrown into the House of Representatives. Chaos.
Yikes. So what happened as a result of that near disaster?
It was a clear signal something had to change, and it led directly to the 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804.
And that amendment?
That created the system we have now. Separate electoral votes for president and vice president. So you couldn't have that kind of tie between running mates again.
Okay, crisis averted. But the political plates kept shifting, right? The Federalists eventually faded.
Yeah, their opposition to the War of 1812 really hurt their popularity, and they gradually disappeared from the national stage. But the Democratic Republicans, they didn't stay unified for long either.
What split them?
Internal divisions started showing up, especially over economic development, like should there be a national bank, versus more populist concerns. Things like expanding voting rights to more white men, focusing on the common man.
And then we get to the corrupt bargain of 1824.
Yeah.
That sounds juicy. What happened there?
Yeah, it was a pivotal moment. Andrew Jackson actually won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes in the 1824 election.
But not a majority.
Exactly, not an outright majority. So, according to the Constitution, the election went to the House of Representatives.
Okay.
Now, Henry Clay, who came in fourth and apparently really disliked Jackson, was Speaker of the House. He used his influence to swing the vote to John Quincy Adams, whose economic views were closer to Clay's.
And Adams won.
Adams won. Jackson and his supporters were absolutely furious. They called it a corrupt bargain, and that whole episode really set the stage for the next phase, a clearer two-party system.
Which is the second party system. Who were the main players now?
So now you have the formal creation of the Democratic Party really coalescing around Andrew Jackson. They positioned themselves as champions of the common person, pushed for westward expansion, and strongly opposed a national bank.
And their opponents?
Their main opposition became the Whig Party. They grew out of the old national Republicans and generally favored policies promoting economic development, industry, that sort of thing.
The source says the Democrats under Jackson were maybe the first really modern party. What made them modern?
It's how they organized. They really went all in on organizing the electorate on a massive scale. They capitalized on expanding voting rights for white men, built party structures right down to the local level.
Grassroots stuff.
Totally. And they perfected the spoils system, rewarding party loyalists with government jobs. These local groups trading favors for votes, those became known as political machines. They also focused a lot on what was called personal politics, building direct connections with voters.
Sounds like they really cracked the code for building a movement back then. But this democratic dominance didn't last forever. Slavery became the big fault line.
Exactly. The fights over slavery in the 1850s just tore the existing system apart. That, combined with growing industrial interests in the North, led to the birth of the Republican Party.
With Lincoln.
With Lincoln as their nominee in 1860. They drew huge support in the North. The Democrats remained strong, especially in the South. And interestingly, the Republicans quickly adopted those same mass organization techniques the Democrats had pioneered.
And basically, ever since the Civil War, it's been Democrats and Republicans as the main players.
Pretty much, yeah. They've been the two dominant forces in American politics since then.
Okay, so we've tracked the rise of the big two. But what about all the other parties? The source talks about third parties or minor parties. Can you give us some examples and maybe why they haven't usually broken through?
Sure. American history is full of them. The source has a chart showing their vote share over time. You had the Populist Party in the late 1800s pushing for things like railroad regulation, income tax.
Important stuff.
Definitely. Then Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Bull Moose Party in 1912, we talked about their platform earlier, women's suffrage, 8-hour day. More recently, you had the Dixiecrats, the states' rights Democrats, who split off mainly over civil rights.
But none of them really replaced the big two. Why is it so hard for third parties in the U.S.?
Well, there are several reasons. Often they have a pretty narrow focus, or they're built around one specific charismatic leader. Getting broad support across the whole country is just tough.
And the major parties can react.
Yeah, the big parties can sometimes co-opt the third party's popular ideas, sort of stealing their thunder. And then there's the spoiler effect.
Ah.
Strategically, voting for a third party might feel good, but it could draw votes away from the major party candidate you dislike less and accidentally help the one you dislike more win. Like the progressives possibly helping Woodrow Wilson in 1912 by splitting the Republican vote.
So even if they don't win elections, they can still have an impact.
Absolutely. A huge long-term impact, often by forcing the major parties to pay attention to issues they might otherwise ignore.
Okay, so the system itself seems designed to favor two main parties. The source digs into why we have this persistent two-party system. What are the big structural reasons?
A huge factor is the winner-take-all election system we use for most offices.
Meaning
Meaning in each district, only one person wins the seat. There's no prize for second or third place. So voters tend to think, well, I should vote for one of the two parties that actually has a chance of winning. Voting for a small party can feel like throwing your vote away.
And that often works with plurality voting, or first past the post.
Exactly. Plurality voting just means whoever gets the most votes wins, even if it's not over 50%. The source mentions Lincoln winning in 1860 with only about 40%, because the vote was split 4 ways.
How is that different from, say, proportional representation, which the source contrasts it with? There's that figure comparing ballots.
Right. The key difference is how seats are allocated. In proportional systems, people usually vote for a party, not just a candidate, and then seats in the legislature are handed out roughly based on the percentage of the vote each party got.
So a smaller party could get seats.
Yeah. If a party gets 15% of the vote, they'd likely get about 15% of the seats. That makes it much more viable for smaller parties to gain a foothold and actually have representation, unlike our system.
Beyond the voting mechanics, are there other things, institutional, legal, social forces, keeping the two-party system strong?
Oh, definitely. The Electoral College for president, for instance, you have to win states, not just the popular vote, which favors broad parties that can compete nationally. Some argue, like political scientist Gary Cox, that the U.S. hasn't historically had really large, deeply divided groups with totally different visions, which limits the potential base for strong third parties. And then there are the election laws themselves.
How so?
Well, they're often written by Democrats and Republicans, and they can create big hurdles for new parties just to get on the ballot. Things like needing tons of signatures on petitions. There's a picture showing someone doing just that.
So lots of interacting factors locking it in. Okay, let's shift to the shape of modern political parties. The source uses V.O. Key's framework of 3 components. What are they?
Yeah, Key's classic model breaks a party down into 3 parts. The party and the electorate, the party organization, and the party and government.
Okay, let's take the first one. Party and the electorate. Who's in that group?
That's basically the voters, the people out there who identify with a particular party, who tend to consistently support its candidates. We call them party identifiers.
Does that mean they agree with everything the party does?
Not necessarily. It's more like a general preference, a sense of belonging or alignment. They lean that way.
And is this party identification strong among Americans?
It actually is, historically. Most American adults identify as either Republican or Democrat. And even among self-described independents, many admit they lean towards one party or the other.
The source had a poll number.
Yeah, a 2015 poll found something like 88% either identified with or leaned towards a major party. And there are generational patterns, too. The source mentions millennials tending to lean more Democratic. For a lot of voters, their party ID is kind of a mental shortcut when they go to vote.
Okay, so that's the voters. What about the party organization? What does that part do?
So the organization is the formal structure. The people who actually run the party machinery, coordinate activities, support candidates. It's the infrastructure, the nuts and bolts.
And this structure exists at different levels, right? Local, state, national. Let's start local.
Absolutely. Down at the local level, think precincts, counties, that's where the real groundwork happens. Identifying voters, mobilizing them, finding donors, training local candidates, getting volunteers out for election day. It's very hands-on.
Moving up, what about the state party organizations?
State organizations have broader responsibilities. They recruit candidates for statewide offices, governor, senator, and coordinate the campaigns across the state. Fundraising is huge for them now, too. Campaigns are so expensive.
The source mentions some staggering costs for recent campaigns.
Yeah, it's incredible. State parties also try to build unity, especially after messy primaries. They write state platforms, and they select delegates for the national convention.
Which brings us to the National Party Organization. What's their main focus? That picture of Clint Eastwood in the empty chair comes to mind.
Huh, yeah, the conventions. The national organization is primarily focused on the presidency. There are huge fundraisers for the presidential candidate. They coordinate efforts for House and Senate races nationwide. And yes, they organize the national conventions.
Yeah. Which aren't quite the spontaneous events they used to be.
Not really. They used to be high drama, real decision making. Now they're much more like carefully scripted media events to launch the general election campaign, formally announce the nominees, and adopt the national platform. Viewership has actually gone down quite a bit since their heyday.
Okay, voters, organization. That leaves the party in government. Who's that? And what are their challenges?
Party in government is simply the party members who've actually been elected or appointed to public office at all levels, from the school board up to Congress and the White House.
And their main job is?
To try and turn the party's platform and promises into actual policy and law. They organize themselves within government. Republicans have conferences, Democrats have caucuses to discuss strategy, assign committees, elect leaders like the Speaker of the House or Senate Majority Leader.
Sounds straightforward, but the source says it's tricky.
It is, because of things like separation of powers, federalism, office holders answer to different groups, a president answers to the whole country, a Congress member answers to their district or state.
So they might have conflicting priorities.
Exactly. Do you follow the national party line or do you listen to your local constituents? It creates tension. Even when one party controls everything, keeping everyone on the same page is hard. And the minority party often has to be involved to get things done, especially in the Senate, with that 60-vote threshold for many things.
Which flows right into the last section. Divided government and partisan polarization. First off, what is divided government?
Divided government is when one party controls the White House and the other party controls at least one chamber of Congress, the House or the Senate, or both.
And that causes problems.
It definitely can. It makes passing laws much harder because the two branches run by opposing parties often want different things. It's hard for anyone to claim credit for successes, and sometimes it leads to gridlock or even government shutdowns.
Which the source says have become more common.
Yeah, much more common since around the late 1960s, early 70s. It happens regardless of which party holds which branch, really.
And this seems linked to partisan polarization. What does that mean?
Polarization means the two parties are moving further apart ideologically. There are fewer moderates, moderate Republicans, conservative Democrats getting elected. The parties are becoming more ideologically distinct, clustered more towards the ends of the spectrum.
So voters get clearer choices, maybe.
That's one potential upside, yes. But the downside is much more conflict and much less cooperation between the parties in Washington. The source notes a definite decline in moderates starting around the 1990s.
And the consequences of this polarization? Less getting done.
Pretty much. Congress has generally been passing fewer laws in recent decades. The threat of government shutdowns is almost routine now. It can even rattle financial markets, like during the debt ceiling debates. And, maybe not surprisingly, public approval of Congress stays really low.
So what's causing this polarization? The source points to a few things.
One big factor is called sorting. It means voters are increasingly aligning themselves with the national party that matches their views on major issues.
Like the South-shifting Republican.
Exactly. The Solid South used to be reliably Democratic, but shifted largely due to social issues like race. And moderate Republicans find it harder to stay in their party, too. Arlen Specter switching parties is a famous example.
What about technology and media? How does that play a role?
Well, the argument is that the rise of national news, first TV, then cable, now the internet makes politicians more accountable to a national audience and the national party line.
Less wiggle room to be different locally.
Kind of. It's harder to tailor messages just for your home district when national media covers everything constantly. You see figures becoming national symbols of their party's ideology.
And then there's the elephant in the room, gerrymandering. How does drawing district lines impact polarization? That Austin example looks pretty wild.
Gerrymandering is definitely part of the conversation. Drawing district lines specifically to favor one party creates lots of safe seats.
Meaning the election isn't really competitive.
Right. Incumbents in safe seats are mostly worried about a primary challenge from within their own party, not the general election. So they have less incentive to compromise or appeal to moderate voters.
Technology makes this easier now.
Much easier. After the Supreme Court's one-person, one-vote rule, districts had to be redrawn more often, and sophisticated mapping software allows for incredibly precise partisan map drawing.
Is it the main cause of polarization, though?
There's debate. Polarization has increased in the Senate too, and you can't gerrymander states. But it's likely a contributing factor, especially working together with that sorting effect we talked about. You see states trying to create independent commissions to handle redistricting now, precisely because of these concerns.
Lastly, the source mentions political movements like the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. How did they fit into this?
These grassroots movements can really push the established parties. The Tea Party, with its focus on limited government and low taxes, definitely pulled the Republican Party further right. You saw that with things like the anti-tax pledge becoming almost mandatory for candidates.
And Occupy.
Occupy Wall Street, focusing on inequality and corporate power, energized the left wing of the Democratic Party. It boosted figures like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who pushed for more social spending and higher taxes on the wealthy.
And Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter powerfully brought racial justice issues to the forefront, sparking major protests, but also highlighting the really deep partisan divides and how those issues are seen and discussed.
Wow. Okay, we have definitely covered a lot of ground here, really digging into this chapter on political parties. It's clear, despite all the criticism, they are just woven into the fabric of U.S. democracy.
Absolutely. We've looked at what they are, what they do, how they evolved through these different party systems, and the really significant challenges they face now with polarization and maintaining unity, all shaped by election rules and social changes.
So, for you, the listener, hopefully the big takeaway is a much richer understanding of the history and the structures that shape the political world we see today, which can often seem, well, chaotic.
And maybe it leaves you with a big question to chew on. Given these trends, the deep polarization, how hard it is for third parties, what kinds of fundamental changes, if any, could reshape the American party system? Could anything make it, function more effectively? And maybe just as important, what's the role of the individual voter in how this all evolves? Definitely some food for thought there.